When we are dealing with fantasy worlds and stories, there's almost no exception. Sooner or later, we will come across the need to involve armies in our setting. Some of the nations in your world just can't get along, and voila, you have a war on your hand. But how far did medieval armies travel, and how can you make sure that you let it play out realistically? That's what we're going to explore here today. So let's get into it. Hi guys, my name is Jesper and welcome to the Fane of Fantasy. This channel is all about giving you inspiration to master your craft and create fantasy that will truly immerse your audience. Warfare in the Middle Ages is one that many of us fantasy fans do find fascinating. Knights, castles, and that sort of thing is just pretty cool. When depicted on the big screen in cinemas, great battles are awesome, but in many cases we aren't told about the way that the soldiers actually got to where the fighting would take place. You did have to worry about supplies too. I'll get to that in a few minutes, but in general there isn't a ton of source material out there on how this actually worked. I guess the people of the time was more concentrated and concerned with recording the battles rather than how the army walked there. Well, I guess who can blame them, right? This fact is probably also one of the reasons as to why many of us creators find it pretty difficult to work out how long it takes to travel from one place to another. Keep in mind that in today's day and age, with motorized transportation systems, we have a, let's say, very different understanding of vast distances compared to the understanding that would be prevalent in the Middle Ages. It also goes without saying that the speed of an army would depend on things like weather conditions, how much they had to carry with them, and how fast the pace of the march were. With those caveats out of the way, let's see if we can come up with some or a rule of thumb. A good source to look at is the Romans. You know, there is a reason why I use this reference in my book on fantasy mapmaking too. Because the Romans had truly mastered this art. When they marched on roads, many accounts states that the Roman legions could travel up to 50 miles in a single day. However, one would have to assume that this amount of distance was achieved when the soldiers kept an impressive pace. On average, you're more looking at like 30 miles a day, and once again, this assumes that roads are available. What you will have to ask yourself when considering how far the army or armies in your fantasy world can travel is what the terrain looks like, and also how experienced the army is with logistics. Comparing to the Roman legions means that we are comparing to the masters of the skill, so subtract miles accordingly with your own army. This is an easy rule of thumb that can help you determine if it takes days, weeks, or months to travel from point A to point B. In fact, this topic of traveling distance is the easy part to work out. As I hinted at just before, the supply chain is really where the medieval army would face most challenges. Keeping an army on the move fed was no simple task, and it often ended up with individual lords and knights doing their best to provide for the men directly under their own command. Let's have a closer look at the topic of supplies, as I think it's important if you want to give your audience a feel of authenticity when it comes to your medieval type army. If you have watched the videos on this channel regularly, you know how my aim is to master the craft of creating immersing fantasy worlds, settings and characters. Therefore, neglecting the supply chain would not be the way to go, so to speak. Should this be your first time here though, do make sure to subscribe. I share new videos every single Monday. In most cases, medieval armies had no good logistics system, and once again, the Romans were the best at this. To be fair, their system wasn't perfect either, but there is something to be said about the fact that the Roman troops could survive being under siege without starving. Not many armies could achieve that. So, as I said before, in most cases it was up to the Lord and the knights to ensure that the men were fed. Soldiers could carry a week's worth of food with them, but this was not nearly enough for long-term campaigning. Here I'm not even mentioning how the horses in the army would need 20 pounds of feed every day. You could of course say that horses can just be grassed, but that would take time away from traveling. To this end, armies would often use ships to take care of resupplying the army as they traveled along a river or along the coastline. Or if they were inland, then foraging was about the only true option. So let's take a closer look at these two alternatives. Ships first. It goes without saying that having ships stocked with food and fodder following you was an excellent method. The downside, of course, is that the army is restricted to follow waterways. But it did allow you to keep up the pace, as you didn't have to worry about foraging along the way. If you have ships following the troops in your world, then you can apply the rule of thumb and have your army moving up to 30 miles a day. In most cases, you probably want to say 20 miles, as not every army will be skilled at logistics as skilled as the Roman ones. If your armies are forced to head inland, then they would likely have animals pulling carts with supplies, and they would then have to rely on foraging. This reduces the army's speed to about 5 to 10 miles a day, so significantly slower. Let's have a look at this foraging concept. So what is it? I guess it depends on who you are asking. The soldiers would say that it means time spent on looking for food, whereas the local populace would say that it kind of means plundering. Well, not kind of, it is plundering. The most practical approach to take would be to create a mounted foraging party, say like a 50 or 100 men on horseback, and then bring pack horses with you and have these people ride out and basically steal food. If I'm to give you a rule of thumb again, this foraging party shouldn't travel more than 60 miles away from the army itself. Otherwise, they simply won't get back in time get back to the army within a reasonable amount of time. That was what I was trying to say. There is a point buried here though that I want to touch on. So if you imagine this massive army traveling ahead at a pace of 5 to 10 miles a day, sending foraging parties out as they go, you will find the consequence on the land quite visible. So if you were to visit one of these areas after the army had passed through, well, it would be kind of a wasteland. You know, local peasants would likely have fled, villages left empty and ransacked. You see how this can actually be used as a story element too? So imagine your character coming by one of these places, finding everything desolate, and wondering what happened here. This is why you find the walled towns being built in the Middle Ages. Foraging was time-consuming though, and it could be dangerous too. So locals would arm themselves and in some cases successfully actually defend themselves. For this reason, many generals sought to keep the peace as they moved their armies through an area. Local officials would be contacted ahead of the army's arrival and told that they would be spared if they gave up food and so forth. In most cases, there was nothing stopping the armies from doing what they wanted, so there is that. I wanted to mention Richard the Lionheart, King of England in the late 12th century, as an example here. He was an outstanding example of someone who had understood logistics, and as such can be used for inspiration for your own army general if you want to. Previous crusaders who had made moves on the Holy Land had suffered greatly from a lack of logistical planning, but Richard led a large army through hostile and barren countries to be resupplied by ships as they moved along the coast. In this fashion, he defeated Saladin, the great Muslim general, and when Richard finally had to march inland to besiege Jerusalem, he found that Saladin also understood logistics. So Saladin had simply stripped the countryside bare of food and fodder, and he had poisoned the wells along the way. And trying to besiege Jerusalem would leave Richard's army exposed to starvation. So Richard had to settle for a treaty that guaranteed Christian pilgrims access to the holy places. This is another way in which you can deal with warfare in your setting. It doesn't always have to come to blows. Sometimes it can be more about strategic maneuvers and outmatching your enemies without actually getting into any fighting. I have more or less all the details in place by now for my new writing project, which is how to plot a novel. There are so many ways to approach this topic, and I had to carefully consider the pros and cons of each one in order to decide the best one, but also most efficient way on how to plot a novel. I expect that I'll start writing within the next 2 weeks or something like that, but from there on it will be quite a while. Book 3 of the Keystone Brone trilogy has also been released by the way, so you can follow the link in the description field below to my website. The full trilogy is now complete, so it's a good time to get into reading if you are interested in a fantasy tale. Which I guess you could be since you are watching this video. Alright, if you haven't done so already, make sure to follow me on social media. Stay safe out there and see you next Monday.